Morning, everyone. Well, actually, my favorite part is having the meeting really starting. My name is Jennifer Turner, and I direct the China Environment Forum here at the Woodrow Wilson Center. Those of you new to the Wilson Center, I think a couple of you maybe, we were created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to Woodrow Wilson in his spirit of policymaker and scholar, that we tried to bring the scholarly and policy communities together around foreign policy issues. The China Environment Forum is but one of the 20-some projects and programs here. We've been for 12 years bringing together government, NGO, business, and researchers around energy and environmental issues in China, and of course, as you could tell from today, the wildlife trading issue as well. Today's meeting is not just from us, though. It was co-sponsored by the Brazil Institute and the Environmental Change and Security Program. I like keeping intros short because we want to hear from them, right? Today's talk is, as you saw from the title, is we kind of stole part of the title from the book that is the anchor of this meeting, but the meeting is Animal Investigators Solving Wildlife Crimes and Saving Endangered Species in Brazil and China. A few months ago, the author, Laurel Neame, we were connected somehow, and we hit it off on the phone, and I said, yeah, it'd be great to have you come have this meeting. And then a couple weeks ago, the book came, and actually, I didn't tell Laura yet, I really don't really like you today. Because, see, I work full-time and have a small child, and I'm tired now because I've been staying up late because I wanted to read this book. I never get to read books. It's a fascinating book, and she did not pay me to say this. But what I liked about the book was that, I mean, not only did it give me more insight in some of the more, still gloomy trends of illegal wildlife trading, but there's actually kind of a hint, I mean, for me, optimism. I mean, the book is basically, you could say, CSI for wildlife. I mean, the core of the book is looking at the world's only forensic lab for wildlife investigations that was set up by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And it's utterly fascinating because the China Environment Forum, we've had many meetings over the years talking to groups like International Fund for Animal Welfare and WWF and CI, Conservation International, about the work they're doing in China with Chinese communities, working more on the demand side issue in China and also with farmers and livelihood, why you shouldn't kill the elephants and things. But this is a different world. And it's your world. It's very exciting about the actual what it really means to enforce and how science is being brought in to make enforcement possible. So what we'll have is that Laurel's going to talk about her cool book, which is strategically placed in the skull of
a tiger, Siberian tiger male.
And she's allowed to have that right, for demo purposes. And so she's going to talk about her book and about, kind of this new world, this world that was very new to me. I mean, actually, honestly, I don't even watch CSI on TV, so this is like utterly fascinating for me. And then we're going to have Kevin Garlick, who is a special agent in charge, and he directs the branch of investigations of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Law Enforcement. You're over in Virginia.
Yes, I am.
Yes, he is. So he's not the scientist type. So don't. So he's not a scientist. He's not going to tell you about kind of she'll be able to tell you the kind of gross things that they do in the science lab, but he can tell you about, I don't know if it's gross, but the details, sometimes mundane, possibly of what it's like to be the law enforcement officer. He works with people in Asia, the ASEAN group, and so he's given us the law enforcement bit. And then we've got Crawford Allen from WWF, and he's the director of Traffic North America. And most of his work does seem to focus on Asia, unless he lied to me earlier. The bio is saying, like, the truth. And he's going to be talking about the work in Asia that he's been doing and giving us insights into the Chinese enforcement, and also but that it's his focus on the regional issue. But this is a global problem. We're focusing on two of the cases. Laurel focused on two of the cases in her book, two of which were Brazil and China. But it is global. U.S. playing a role. We consume the most, right? Almost. It's neck and neck with China. CO2 emissions, animal consumption. All right. And so before I start, I do want to, Laurel, because she really is keen on knowing her audience. I'm just passing around the participant sheet, and if you're willing, put your email down because she might want to shoot you an email later. Okay? Are you guys all ready? All geared up, caffeinated? We can do this. All right. So, welcome, and Laurel, set us off.
Thanks for the lovely introduction. I want to first thank this Woodrow Wilson Center, especially the China Environment Program and Brazil Institute for having me, and also thanks to the Center for webcasting it, and to everyone for being here, because it shows an interest in wildlife trafficking and wildlife forensics, which is really an underknown problem here. And animal investigators, what Jennifer was saying, is a CSI for wildlife that shows how the world's first and only dedicated wildlife crime lab is helping to solve crimes and save endangered species. It really, to me, it shows us a new set of heroes and reveals a new arsenal of techniques that are thwarting this billion-dollar global trade in illegal animal parts. And in Animal Investigators, I follow 3 true cases of wildlife crime from beginning to end. That is, from the undercover sting that might have caught the illegal trafficker, to the forensic investigation that followed, to the court case or other outcomes that might have come up from the case. And first is the case of Alaskan walrus slaughtered for their tusk ivory. And that's made a lot more complex because the role of the native people has a culture centered around the hunt. Second is an investigation into the trade in bear gallbladders, and that's used in traditional Asian medicine, and I'll talk more about that in a minute. And third is the world of illegal smuggling of Brazilian Amazon Indian feather art that exploits the native people who made it and threatens jaguars, scarlet macaws, harpy eagles, and other protected tropical animals. Unfortunately, I had a lot of cases to choose from because thousands of species are affected by wildlife trade. Just as background, every year more than 25,000 primates, 2 to 3 million birds, 10 million reptile skins, and over 500 million tropical fish are legally traded each year. The numbers traded illegally may equal that, but we simply don't know. What we do know is that the scale is massive. This picture here shows a collection of items that Fish and Wildlife Service confiscated just at the JFK airport in New York. And for the animals, the problem is that it's plundering species already under threat and least able to withstand the losses. Right now, we're losing 30,000 plant and animal species each year. That's roughly 3 species an hour. Overall, 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, and 1 in 3 amphibians face a high risk of extinction soon. Now, that's not all from wildlife trafficking, but wildlife trafficking contributes to and hastens these trends. As then Assistant Secretary of State Claudia McMurray warned at a March 2008 congressional hearing, illegal wildlife trade has brought us to a tipping point that is driving many species to the brink of extinction. And the kinds of illegally trafficked species run the gamut, from butterflies to birds, lizards to leopards, and turtles to tigers. As one agent in my home state of Vermont put it, nobody is trafficking in sparrows. The more rare the animal, the more likely someone wants it, and the more willing someone is to sell it. And killing wild animals is big business. While much wildlife trade is legal, a huge black market exists, especially in endangered species. Illegal wildlife smuggling could be worth as much as $20 billion annually and probably ranks behind drugs and human trafficking and ahead of weapons trafficking as the 3rd largest black market crime in the world. Now, of course, we don't know that for sure because traffickers aren't reporting sales figures, but it's big. The motive for the crime is simple. Money. A pair of birdwing butterflies goes for $8,500. A chatouche shawl, like you see here, from the wool of 5 Tibetan antelope, can sell for between $15,000 and $20,000. A breeding pair of black palm cockatoos can fetch $80,000. And ounce for ounce, animal products like rhino horn or deer musk can be worth more than gold, diamonds, or cocaine. A kilogram of bear bile, for example, has a street value of $40,000. That's more than cocaine, which is worth about $30,000 a kilo. And rhino horn sells for about $50,000 a kilo. And it's big business in part because while profits are high, penalties for wildlife trafficking are very low, often just the cost of doing business. And that's especially true compared to drug trafficking. The maximum penalty for a felony wildlife trafficking conviction under the Lacey Act is 5 years and $250,000, but typically it's far less. By comparison, for simple possession with intent to sell cocaine, not even selling it, the maximum is 20 years in prison and $1 million, and then it goes up from there. So this lure of high profits and low risk has prompted everyone to get in on the act, from petty criminals out to make a quick buck to organized crime networks and terrorist organizations that use the profits to fund their military juntas. The trade is now what House Natural Resources Chairman Nick Rahal calls the wildlife version of blood diamonds. Almost every country is involved in some way or another. Some as suppliers, some as buyers, and often both. China and the United States, the two biggest consumers of illegal wildlife products, fall into this latter category as both suppliers and consumers. Shipments cross multiple boundaries and go in every direction, and that's one of the reasons it's so hard to track. So bear bile from China is mailed to Los Angeles, where it's distributed to the Asian community, and illegal bear gallbladders from the United States and Canada are both sold domestically and shipped to Asia. So it goes every direction. And further complicating matters is a complexity of laws, because typically some species are protected and others are not. So an ivory carving from warthog is legal, one from elephant ivory is not. Turkey feathers can be bought and sold, but eagle feathers cannot. A wool shawl from cashmere goats is okay, but one from Tibetan antelopes is not. And traffickers know that, and they take advantage of it. So when they're caught, they simply claim that the items that they're selling are from unprotected species, which are legal, instead of the protected ones, which are not. And unless you can prove otherwise, there's nothing you can do about it. And they go free, and the products come in. And that's what happened until about 20 years ago, when the wildlife crime lab that I talk about in Animal Investigators, the first and only dedicated wildlife crime lab in the world, opened its doors. Now, we're all familiar with crime shows like CSI, so we have this image of forensics. And human and wildlife forensics are similar in that they both use science to answer a legal question. Both also aim to link a crime to a suspect and a victim. The difference is that wildlife forensics deals with 30,000 species of victim, and human forensics deals with just one, Homo sapiens. So that means that wildlife forensics has an extra job of figuring out what the victim is. And that question, what is the victim, is essential for establishing that a crime even occurred. But it's far easier said than done. With human forensics, typically there's a body in the lab. But with animal forensics, while sometimes there's a body, most of the time the victim has been sliced and diced and processed into some product, like a powdered medicine, a belt, or an ivory pendant. Here's some examples. And that really makes it hard to tell what it is. All the things that would tell you this is elephant or this is bear simply aren't there. Let me show you what I mean by telling you a little bit about two of the cases in Animal Investigators. And each year, in Brazil's Amazon, 38 million animals are stolen from the rainforest. Its vast size, it covers nearly half of Brazil, combined with its limited accessibility and its abundant rare and endemic species, have made it a haven, really, for a booming illegal wildlife trafficking business. Folks estimate that it's worth perhaps $1 to $2 billion a year just in the Amazon alone. And really what Colombia is to cocaine, Brazil has become to the illegal animal trade. And that simple fact was what raised an agent's suspicion in the late 1990s and started what was the Brazilian Federal Police's first case against environmental crime. One hot summer day in late June, a simple package arrived at the International Mail Facility at Dulles Airport, right outside Washington, D.C. And smugglers often ship contraband through the mail. Given the thousands of packages in the mail each day, they play the odds and figure that their package will skip inspection. And sometimes they're right, but sometimes they're wrong. This time it was a long, thin box, about 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and it was wrapped in plain brown paper. It looked like any other package. But the smudged handwritten address, return address, caught the agent's eye. It was from Manaus, Brazil, in the heart of Brazil's Amazon. So the agent slipped on a pair of rubber gloves and slid open the package. And as he bent back the flaps, a smell of mothballs wafted out. and he quickly saw why. It was to protect the contents from insects. He tossed aside the crumpled newspaper covering the top and lifted out, one after the other, 28 different headdresses, earrings, belts, and other body costumes made from bird feathers, teeth, and other animal parts. Now, traditionally, Amazon Indians made elaborate headdresses, armbands, and earrings out of feathers and teeth for their rituals and ceremonies because they believed they'd adopt the characteristics of the animals that they wore. So you might have a shaman wearing a headdress with 2-foot-long red feathers spiking up to the sky, and that would connect him to the spirit world. And historically, tribes used feathers from birds that they hunted, or else they kept them as pets and plucked some of the feathers or captured them without killing them. But once collectors in Europe and the U.S. saw what they considered were beautiful primitive art pieces, they wanted to possess them and to display them and hang them on their walls. And that really changed things by creating a high-profit market. What nobody knew when this simple package was opened was that it was part of a much larger operation, one that involved a broad network of clients in the U.S. and Europe, and also an extensive network of suppliers in Brazil who was selling to this guy, but also to other people who also had their own network of clients in the U.S. and Europe. And even worse, what this case would ultimately reveal was that many of the buyers weren't even getting an artifact made by the Indians. What traffickers were doing was they were meeting their demand by making grocery lists of animal parts that they needed, like, I need 12 scarlet macaw tail feathers, and then hiring poachers to go get them, and ultimately making these supposedly authentic Indian artifacts themselves. And this package was one of hundreds that were shipped. Here's an example of some of the other pieces in this case. But at the time, the agent didn't know what he had, and he suspected the artifacts came from included parts from protected species, but to prove it, he sent it to the lab. And these pictures show some of the artifacts that the lab had to identify. Now, if you think about it, identification of species from feathers alone is really complicated. Now, normally ornithologists have a lot to go with, and how many of you are bird watchers? And when you look at birds, you look at the bird's size, its shape, its plumage pattern. You also use other clues like where it is, its habitat, its song, its vocalizations, its flight pattern, what it's eating, and lots of other behavior. But at the lab, the forensic ornithologist has just one thing to go on, a single feather. And most birds have about 5,000 feathers on their body. So that's a lot of feathers. And feathers from one part of the bird, like the wing, this is a wing feather, might exhibit what are called diagnostic characteristics. That's something unique to the species. While feathers from another part of the bird might not. And here are some feathers from the same bird, here and also in the picture there. And you can see just the variation of feathers from one bird. These ones are primary wing feathers from an immature golden eagle. So when you think about it too, feathers from the same bird can vary, but also feathers for birds of the same species but different animals can vary. They differ for males and females, juveniles and adults. So that's a lot of variation in the same species. And the same thing happens with claws and teeth. There's a lot of variation within the same species. So think about your own teeth. Are they all the same? Another of the pieces examined for this case was this very beautiful Bororo shaman's necklace, and it has 4 fangs on the bottom. And again, the scientists were asked to determine what kind of animal these teeth came from. If it was from a protected species, which they suspected, the agent could then show that the trafficking ring involved far more than just birds and included mammals too. So this particular piece was key. Because of their shape, the scientists pretty much knew that they were canines from a carnivore. But what kind? They started by narrowing down the choices. And we'll do the same by looking at the canines of these skulls. And at first glance, you can see just I'm not going to lift them up because they're too far away, but you can see that the canines of these skulls vary, the size of them. And the canines of a tiger, which is holding this book, are quite large, and the bobcat, which is the middle one, are quite small. So just by the size alone, they could narrow down the choices. So now that you're thinking about size and shape, you think about what makes them vary. And for cats, like I have here, the size and shape of canines are really based on the skull and body size, the prey type, and the killing method. So if you think about a cheetah, for example, a cheetah kills by running after its prey. So it needs a very streamlined body, streamlined skull, and so the teeth have to be sort of streamlined to fit in that shape. And also it eats soft prey like antelopes, so its teeth can be narrower within the skull. But for something like a jaguar, which is the third skull I have here and the picture up here, it needs tougher and sort of more robust canine teeth, and that would help it kill in one bite and get at its very much tougher fare, which is turtles and reptiles. So it needs stronger teeth, and that's exactly what the scientists did, and they found that these teeth belong to a jaguar, which is a protected species. And these were many of the items in the hall for this trafficking ring. This necklace, which is held by the head of the investigation on the Brazil side, shows a necklace with 44 jaguar teeth, which was made from at least 11 jaguars. So one piece, 11 protected animals. All in all, the trafficking ring involved well over 2,000 separate artifacts, with each one involving multiple species that had to be identified. So you can see from this discussion both that a single trafficker can have a big impact on the animals, but also that the job facing these scientists is not easy, because one piece of evidence can involve multiple identifications. And finding an identifying characteristic when you have just a part, like a tooth or a feather, is very complicated. So now imagine that you don't even know what the part is. It's a tooth or a tusk that's been carved, so you don't have the size or the shape to go on. Or it's a rhino horn or bear gallbladder that's been ground up into a powdered medicine, and that's often what you find in China. And much of the illegal wildlife trade in China involves animal parts used in food and medicine. So that you have gourmet delicacies like shark fins and bear paws, turtle eggs, which have become status symbols for many citizens. And for thousands of years, parts from rare species like deer musk, tiger bones, pangolin scales have been used in traditional Chinese medicine. And meanwhile, many rare animals like tigers, rhinos, bears, and other animals are being poached to meet that demand. Now, Crawford is going to talk a lot more about wildlife trafficking in China and the rest of Asia, so I'll just focus on one of the cases in Animal Investigators, which involves illicit trade in bear gallbladders used for the traditional Chinese medicine market. And as background, the Asian black bear, which is also called a moon bear for the crescent-shaped cream-colored moon on its chest, is endangered largely because its bile is really coveted for traditional Chinese medicine. And bile is a fluid that's secreted by the liver, and it helps the body process fats. It's stored in the gallbladder, which is a pear-shaped sac that can stretch from the size of a grape to the size of your fist. And for thousands of years, bear bile has been used to treat a variety of diseases like liver disease and gallstones, and it's been found so effective that Western medicine synthesizes it. But people tend to prefer the natural product, and that preference has led to a search for alternate sources. And one of these sources is the milking of the bile from captive bears. In fact, China and other Asian countries have set up hundreds of bear farms to harvest the bile from live Asian black bears, ostensibly to stop them from being hunted in the wild. And currently there are about 7,000 bears on farms in China, 4,000 in Vietnam, 1,600 in South Korea. It's a common practice, and China has set up similar farms for other animals like musk deer and tigers. But for bears, there are many questions about the process of milking the bile. And this bear, named Chengdu Truth, was rescued from a bear bile farm in China, but died a few days after arriving at the sanctuary. And that's really a common occurrence for rescued bears, because squalid conditions and unsafe medical practices in many farms are inhumane, And estimates are that they have the lives of farmed bears compared to wild bears. But laws are changing, and China recently instituted a series of measures to improve conditions. But many animal advocates argue that the milking procedure is still inhumane and should be stopped. Many also say that farming also increases demand and stimulates it by providing a cheaper product. But the desire for the natural product has also prompted people to turn to other sources of bear bile, most notably North American black bears, which are very similar to Asian black bears. And in Animal Investigators, I follow an undercover investigator as he buys 188 gallbladders from a trafficker. And before he could nail the guy, however, he really needed to prove that the organs were from bear. And this is a sampling of bear gallbladders. And so the scientist's job is to find out what makes a bear's gallbladder unique. And actually, a bear gallbladder is very similar to a pig gallbladder. So what makes it different than a pig or any other animal? So for each species, the lab has to find some sort of identifying characteristic. And they have to do it for each part of each species. So for bear gallbladders, using chemical analysis, they figured out that bear gallbladders have 3 unique bile acids, unique levels of bile acids. For a canine tooth of a bear, and those are prized for fetishes and ornaments. The scientists in morphology discovered that it's the lack of a groove on the inside of the tooth together with a brown ring on the enamel of the canine, and that's how you can tell that it's a bear's tooth. So for each part of each species, it's different, and it doesn't end there, because the lab also has to account for the many different ways an item might be processed. So, for instance, for bear gallbladders, they can be fresh, frozen, dried, crystallized powders. They can be in an ointment. They can be in pill form. They can even be in alcohol. There was one case where the trafficker was smuggling bear bile in whiskey, and so the lab had to evaporate it off to even find the bile. And there was another case where the bile was in chocolate. So imagine trying to find bear bile in chocolate. So the scientists have no cookbook to follow. So every time they take a new case, they push the science of wildlife forensics forward. And the end result is that the lab links traffickers to their crimes so that they can be prosecuted, because without enforcement, laws are just advice. It's incredibly effective. In over 90% of the cases that the lab's involved in, suspects end up pleading out. Yet, even though the lab has slowed the pace of wildlife trafficking, much more is needed. Law enforcement officers, which I'm sure Kevin will talk about,
since he has one, yes,
suspect that they're only intercepting 10% of what's out there, and some say less than that. Really, agencies are woefully understaffed. In the United States, which is one of the world's largest markets for wildlife, illegal wildlife products, and it's also a major source of supply, there are roughly 200 federal wildlife special agents. And you compare that to over 12,000 FBI special agents, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and also more than 5,000 Drug Enforcement Administration special agents. And it's the same around the world. Staffing levels are tiny compared to the need. But even in the best of circumstances, law enforcement can't completely prevent illegal trading as long as demand exists. The bottom line is that as long as someone wants tiger bone or elephant ivory, traffickers will find a way to sell it, whatever the law. The victims of animal crimes are silent, and animal investigators, like the Wildlife Forensics Lab and special agents, give them a voice, but it's up to us to maintain their ability to speak. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, now we're moving over to one of the 200.
A little less than 200 right at the moment, I think.
So he's a special
I rounded up.
Good morning. My name is Kevin Garlick. I'm with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Office of Law Enforcement. Wildlife trade enforcement in the United States is primarily the responsibility of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The service enforces federal wildlife laws, many which prohibit or restrict international trade in wildlife parts, and wildlife products. The Endangered Species Act is a critical statute in this regard. It prevents species listed by the service as endangered or threatened from moving in trade and implements the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, CITES for short, in the United States. Like ESA and CITES, a number of other U.S. wildlife laws address trade in specific species. Examples include our Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which protects some 800 bird species, and the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which restricts trade in such wildlife as walrus, polar bear, whale, and sea otter. Our Wild Bird Conservation Act makes the U.S. a more restrictive market for avian species, most of which are also protected under CITES. Other U.S. laws go further with respect to trade limits, including the African Elephant Conservation Act and the product labeling provisions of the Rhino-Tiger Conservation Act. Under the Lacey Act, our nation's oldest wildlife law, the service has authority, among other things, to prevent the importation of any fish, wildlife, or plant that has been taken or exported in violation of the conservation laws of another country. The Lacey Act also comes into play when wildlife moves in international or interstate commerce after being unlawfully taken or traded under another federal law here in the United States or any state or tribal resource conservation law. These provisions make the Lacey Act a significant enforcement tool in the trade arena. Violations of the ESA and CITES are by statute misdemeanor offenses, but an ESA violation involving a listed or CITES species in trade can also be pursued under the Lacey Act, a statute that has felony provisions and felony penalties if the wildlife or plants involved are worth more than $350. The service's enforcement responsibilities also address issues beside illegal trade, issues that include such threats to conservation as habitat destruction and environmental contamination that impacts listed species. Combating illegal wildlife trade is, however, one of our critical parts of our enforcement mission. While the cases Laura explains in her book occurred several years ago, illegal wildlife trade is a continuing threat to wildlife and a continuing challenge to countries, conservationists, and law enforcement officers around the world. With more than 30,000 species now receive protection under the CITES Treaty, enforcement agencies like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and our global counterparts face an array of challenges in combating this threat. So what are some of our challenges? As stated before by Laura, profits are high. Commodities that sell for the equivalent of dimes or dollars in the source country, which is typically an economically developing nation, can yield hundreds, even thousands of dollars at the point of final sale. In a recent service investigation, for example, we saw that sea turtle skins purchased for $70 in Mexico, which were smuggled into the United States and made into high-end sea turtle boots that ultimately were going for sale for up to $500. Black market wildlife trade is not only high in profit, but is also sometimes a low-risk enterprise. Even in the United States, which has some of the strongest and strictest wildlife trade laws, prison sentences and financial penalties often do not reach the maximum, even when prosecutors take care to utilize laws with felony provisions when they bring charges. Another challenge is the new players. High profits and low risk make illegal wildlife trade a growth industry, one that has attracted new elements from two different directions. First, we have seen increasing sophistication and organization at one end of the trade. This trade and these groups use operations that demonstrate detailed planning, significant financial support, sophisticated forgery and altercation of permits and certifications, and international management of shipments. Second, we've seen an increased use in technology, specifically the internet, which makes illegal wildlife trade a crime that can be committed with the click of a mouse. Web-based commerce and communication have given millions of people around the world unparalleled opportunities to wheel and deal in wildlife. Many of the subjects in our most recent investigations have used the internet in the process while committing their wildlife crime. As a result, going undercover to investigate illegal wildlife trade these days often means us going online. The extent to which the internet has facilitated in-field wildlife trafficking is thus a considerable challenge to those of us charged with combating this trade. Another challenge is our limited resources. Here in the U.S., the Fish and Wildlife Service is critical to this effort of fighting wildlife trade. We are the front line in the United States. Our wildlife inspectors are the frontline defense at airports and border crossings throughout the United States. They check declared wildlife imports and exports for compliance with federal statutes. Our special agents turn interceptions of illegal products at the port and tips from informants and connections made in undercover cases into cases and convictions. Are we having an impact? I would say yes. The service would say yes. We seize about $10 million worth of illegal wildlife each year. Recent investigations have broken up trafficking in sea turtle shell and skin, elephant ivory, queen conch meat, live reptiles, sperm whale teeth, and endangered butterflies. Are our efforts worth it? Probably not. We'd be the first to tell you that we're probably only scratching the surface, but we give it a try real hard, and working with our partners, we intend hopefully to make a stop to it. In part, it's a problem with our numbers, as Laurel said. We have about 115 wildlife inspectors at 38 key locations spread throughout the United States. Our regulations mandate that importers and exporters of wildlife bring their shipments in through these ports where we have staff. But smugglers can come in anywhere into the United States, and there are over 300 customs ports of entry. So we are really not at many of the ports where somebody who wants to bring in wildlife products can decide to. Our staffing is equally thin on our investigative side. Last year we hired 27 new officers, but our present ranks are below 200 again as a result of recent retirements and attrition. And that number includes managers like myself and frontline supervisors in the field. So the actual number of field criminal investigators is probably closer to 150 folks. So what are some of our challenges that we need to take upon ourselves? And we need to work smarter is the number one thing that we need to do. In some ways, one of our biggest challenges in combating wildlife trade is working smarter with the resources we have. And so what we've done as one approach is use a set of priorities so that inspections and investigations target the most serious threats to wildlife, including commercial exploitation, as well as the most vulnerable species, those listed by CITES, those listed as endangered or threatened. We've recognized the payoffs of being proactive, so we are having our inspectors spend more time looking for what might be there and less time processing declared shipments. And we're using risk assessment strategies to improve the odds that our efforts will produce results. At JFK International Airport in New York and at LAX in Los Angeles, we have launched special teams to conduct proactive cargo inspections, as well as sweeps of passenger flights and blitzes during special events. We recently had one at the outcome of the Beijing Olympics, where we had extra inspectors on duty at a number of major airports just to check returning American passengers coming back from the Olympics. We've also taken a look at infrastructure enhancements to support our investigations. An expansion of our forensics lab, which was completed in 2007, included a biocontainment area and a state-of-the-art DNA analysis unit. We've increased computer forensics capabilities at the lab and also provided more training for our officers in the field. Our intelligence unit provides critical support services to officers in the field as they pursue investigations. Technology is another way we are making ourselves work smarter and work better in the field. We've automated wildlife declarations and fee payments to save officers time and reduce the amount of paperwork our inspectors handle. We've invested in equipment to improve the effectiveness of our investigations. Examples include regional surveillance vans and portable X-ray machines so that we can look through large shipments more quickly. We've also signed on to the International Trade Data System, a new government-wide trade processing system that is designed to improve the policing of all trade entering the United States. We've also pursued partnerships. Given our size, we know that our success in stemming the illegal wildlife trade will depend in part on how effectively we work with other law enforcement agencies, both in this country and throughout the world. Participating in the ITDS International Trade Data System project that I referred to earlier is only one example of how we're trying to make partnerships work for us and work for wildlife. Our wildlife inspectors often provide training to Customs and Border Protection counterparts, both at their basic training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, as well as additional ongoing training at the ports of entry. We've worked hard to work with them to extend the reach of wildlife law enforcement. Many of our recent investigations have been cooperative cases that our agents have pursued with counterparts from NOAA Fisheries and Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We've also worked successfully with Environment Canada, with authorities in the UK, Belgium, and the Netherlands, as well as the Lusaka Task Force in Africa and the Brazilian Federal Police. International cooperation includes information sharing and engagement with Interpol and the CITES Secretariat. It also involves efforts to improve enforcement capacity in other countries, particularly countries where wildlife resources are at risk, but where enforcement infrastructure is new and struggling. Since 2000, Fish and Wildlife Service special agents, wildlife inspectors, and forensic scientists have participated in more than 55 training programs with our international counterparts. Students have represented more than 60 different countries, and over the past 3 years, for example, we've presented investigative training to our counterparts in the Philippines, Mongolia, Indonesia, Thailand, and Brazil. We conduct a yearly training program for wildlife officers in Africa that is part of the core curriculum at the International Law Enforcement Academy in Botswana. We've also worked closely with regional wildlife enforcement groups, such as the Wildlife Enforcement Network of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. In fact, 2 of our agents have undertaken back-to-back 10-month details working with that group, serving as technical advisors and organizing and conducting additional training programs throughout the region. In closing, international cooperation is clearly critical to addressing the illegal wildlife trade. Any single agency acting alone faces tremendous obstacles, but countries working together can start and make a difference. Thank you.
Great. It also made me realize with the training that your few staff are actually not even here. But a perfect segue, of course, you couldn't, Crawford, did you work this out with him? Perfect segue to Crawford's talk as far as partner, because you guys are good partners of Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yes, we are.
Yes,
okay. All right. And are you okay sitting? Do you want to stand? I do have a mic.
I think we can cue the PowerPoint, please.
Okay. Yeah. The PowerPoint. Can you come around, Ellen? Or just hit escape and then. Sorry. Can you help him get it up?
Well, good morning. My name's Crawford Allen. I'm the Regional Director of Traffic North America. I'm based here in Washington, D.C., although from my accent you may not believe that, but I've been here for quite some years now. I just wanted to thank everybody here for attending. I know you're all very busy, and I really appreciate that. And also wanted to thank Jennifer and the Woodrow Wilson Center for the invitation to speak to you today. I've been asked to give some perspectives from the traffic side of things on illegal wildlife trade in Asia, and particularly the role of China in that trade. There's probably no corner of the globe that is not touched by the major economic growth of China. And it's particularly the case with wildlife trade, and it's felt most clearly by the neighbors to China in the bordering countries in Asia. I'll show you that this photograph here actually is an example from August of 2007. Customs in the Russian Far East in Primorsky Krai, who intercepted this shipment en route to China across the border of nearly 500 bear paws and Siberian tiger skin, as well as ginseng. Just shows you some of the typical seizures that are regularly happening with the movement of wildlife from from parts of Asia and Russian Far East into China. So just to give you a quick insight into traffic, if you don't know who traffic is, with this strange hybrid animal, and as with any hybrid, we've got some good hybrid vigor because we're a partnership between the World Wildlife Fund and IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. With their trade monitoring program, we've been in existence since 1976. We were largely set up to try and support the CITES Treaty, which Kevin mentioned. But since that time, we've expanded our mandate a lot further than that, looking at ways in which we can really help ensure that wildlife trade is sustainable and to help stop the illegal trade. Now, Traffic is a global network. We're probably the world's largest wildlife trade monitoring network with regional programs in 8 regions, and we have about 120, 130 staff at any one time in some 25 offices, but those change from time to time. We have a major gap really in our remit, and that really is sort of the Middle East and Northern Africa and Western Africa. But apart from that, we've got pretty reasonable coverage, because the way wildlife trade works, you have to be having people working, looking along the trade chain to get good results. So, Traffic has programs in East, Southern, and South East Asia, Southern Asia, and Southeast Asia. Just some examples here of the work we've been doing in China, for example. Annually, we produce a sort of state of the nation report on China in terms of wildlife trade, and we do a number of different outreach campaigns and programs. And in Southeast Asia, for example, we recently launched a report with the World Bank looking at what is behind the drivers of wildlife trade. So it's called What's Driving Wildlife Trade, and the results of that showed very clearly that it's China really is driving wildlife trade and in the region, and the wealth of China particularly. And that was one of the key findings, that wealth was more of a driver actually than poverty, which was quite interesting. So despite some over 30 years of international trade controls, as you've heard from Laurel today, the scale and the nature of the trade is enormous and daunting and a major challenge. And while there are some positive stories where some species have been saved from the problems of illegal wildlife trade, there are others which are really under pressure all the time. In recent years, the focus of conservationists, governments, and others, and even donors, has shifted a great deal in terms of wildlife trade towards Asia because of this major rapid wholesale clearance of wildlife to provide both legal and illegal markets. We've just seen a really major problem with empty forests and crisis after crisis, from the tiger crisis to the ivory crisis to even the freshwater turtle crisis. But it's not just species found outside of China. Also, China's been suffering some problems too. And for example, the Tibetan antelope, which Laurel mentioned for chartreuse shawls, has been suffering extensively from poaching and illegal trade. Although China has been taking some very strong efforts to resolve that, and some good progress has been made. But elephant ivory is a key problem, and that white gold really is in demand, as the increasing wealth in China sees people craving luxury items, it seems. And the other item of species of major concern are tigers, where it's probably the greatest concern right now is the threat to tigers in the wild due to plummeting populations in India and the loss of tigers completely from some reserves. But I just wanted to bring you a little case study example here of a particular species that has caused some grave concern for conservation, and actually has been a bit of a flagship species for a rallying response by governments like China and Thailand to really try and solve this problem. Does anybody know what species that is? I don't know if you can see very clearly what that animal is. Does anybody know what that is? Pangolin, yeah, thank you. I don't have to explain what a pangolin is then. Do I? Okay. It's a type of scaly anteater. It's a mammal. It's an incredible animal. It's got armor-plated scales. It rolls up into a ball. It's a nocturnal arboreal species that has a major problem on its hands in that it's tasty, it's useful for medicine, and even its skin can be used for leather. So it's a multi-use species that's very high value and is in demand. Its meat is used in exotic restaurants. Its scales are burnt and used in traditional medicine. And I've seen myself walking through the streets of Geneva, people wearing pangolin skin cowboy boots, which are a very high-cost luxury item. Typically, these animals are captured and bagged live and shipped by truck across from Southeast Asia through to China. This was actually a shipment that was found on the border with Vietnam, and those blue bags all contain live pangolins. They stay fresh, they last a long time, and they survive pretty well. But more recently, we've been seeing this really industrialized, organized crime operating out of Southeast Asia, where there are processing factories now where pangolins are being chopped up into meat, frozen, vacuum packed, and sent on their way, because law enforcement really is starting to understand the problem and are really trying to tackle it. China particularly is taking a lot of efforts and a lot of strong enforcement trying to clamp down on this trade. They've got special investigations teams looking at this trade because it's very well organized, and it's unorganized criminal gangs that are running this. There was one major processing factory in Sumatra recently that was busted in southern Sumatra, where it was set up entirely to process pangolins, and they seized about 14 tons of pangolins at that one time, and there was a seizure in Vietnam of pangolins that came from that processing factory that was about 23 tons of pangolins, and they totaling in about the last 18 months to 2 years, there's probably been about 100 tons of pangolins seized. And one representative from ASEAN Wen, which Kevin mentioned, said that they think that's just the tip of the iceberg in this trade. Just to show you some of the routes, typically the pangolins are being moved out of Sumatra, Borneo, Malaysia, Cambodia and Laos. As I said before, they were largely going by truck, but more and more the value of pangolins has gotten so high and the demand is so high that it's actually economical to send these by air freight now, because the profits are so good, and also more and more we're seeing them moving by sea as well. We've been doing surveys in those regions in Southeast Asia for a few years now, and also in China itself. There are different trade routes often for the meat than there are for the scales, and you can see now that typically for the meat, a lot of the meat is moving across from Myanmar and Laos, and then moving into different distribution centres, often going by land to Yunnan and then on to Guangzhou, but also from Vietnam there, and also by sea into Guangdong as well. And then from there it goes into different other provinces and ports, and to Beijing too. The difference is with the case with pangolin scales, this is for medicine, so it's a different market. It's not going to exotic food restaurants, it's going into the medicine community, into medicine markets, and there are two main medicine markets where they're ending up, and you can see with these points here, and they're also redistributed from there. And some of the scales increasingly are coming across the border from Laos and Vietnam now too. If you look at the price comparisons for pangolins since 1990, you'll see that the prices have increased pretty rapidly, from sort of 80 to 81 up to about 1,500, which we found in 2007 from our surveys in China. And if you think one single pangolin can weigh up to a maximum of 7 kilos, then a live pangolin could fetch between $700 to $1,400 per animal in China. And when you look at the seizures of thousands of animals at a time, you can quickly do the math and realize that these shipments are worth a great deal and very profitable, which is why these organized criminal gangs are very keen to protect their investment. Just show you the prices with the scales. It's slightly different, but it shows the price increase from the early 80s is probably 100 times higher than, has increased by 100-fold today. It's just to close on the pangolin issue. It's pretty sad to show that there's been such a rapid decline, such a whole-scale extraction. And in 2004, the IUCN Red List categorized pangolins as near threatened, so on sort of the lowest scale of threat. within 4 years in 2008, as a result of a lot of this research and a lot of the evidence from these seizures and analysis, they've now jumped across the range of the threat categories to it becoming endangered within a 4-year period in terms of those assessments. So it's been a pretty drastic decline due to this wide-scale spread scale of trade. Now, we did do some analysis on looking at what really is motivating consumers in China. You don't really need to look at the data there. That's just to show we've done some work on this. But in 2008, we've been doing a lot of we've been sitting down, inviting people to come and talk about wildlife consumption and why they're doing that. And whilst only 3% of people actually admitted to being involved in the consumption of the highest level of protection of species, the most threatened species, a lot of the others talk very openly about their consumption for the lesser protected species. And the ones that were being used for the higher level of the more protected species at the highest level, which obviously has more serious penalties, they were only really going to use those for medicinal purposes rather than for food purposes. And with the lesser protected species, they were being consumed really for meat, as in restaurants and for meals. The interesting thing that I found with that was that for those species like turtles and small cats and deer and those things, that they weren't actually, a lot of the incentive wasn't, as we thought before, that this were special meals for business meetings and that sort of thing. That was a part of it, but it was a much less percentage than we thought. And really, finally, the interesting thing about that was that of all the people who admitted to consuming protected species, 87% of them said they were fully in support of wildlife conservation and thought it was a really good thing to do. And obviously, that goes with an ethos of sustaining the wildlife to consume it. So just a little bit about the consumption. This is just an example of the scale of the trade. This is from one of the well-known markets in Guangzhou. I've been to these myself, and you'll just go through the markets and you'll see crate upon crate of thousands upon thousands of freshwater turtles in particular, along with other wildlife. And they are shipped from all over Southeast Asia. And in fact, Southeast Asia is really running out of freshwater turtles now. And so importers are looking further afield and moving to Africa to import turtles and tortoises from, and in fact even the United States. And in the United States, in some of our southern states like Louisiana and Florida, we're really seeing a major harvest for export to China, which is causing some problems, and some states are bringing in strict regulation now to control that harvest because it's really having a detrimental impact. But most perversely, something I found very interesting was, and this is the photo from my local Chinese supermarket in Fairfax County, Virginia. These are actually Asian freshwater turtles, and these are being shipped in from farms in China, where these turtles are being farmed, and they're coming in with all the other Chinese produce for sale here for foodstuffs, and these are live animals. If you go to your local Chinese supermarket, you're likely to find these, along with American bullfrogs as well, which have been farmed in China and are being shipped here for consumption. We found that some of these are actually ending up in the wild, where people will be releasing them into the wild as sort of a mercy gift, and we don't know if there's any ecological risk as yet. It's too early to say. Okay, quickly shifting gears just to the issue of tigers. I mean, obviously, I've mentioned that tigers are a huge conservation concern right now, with less than 4,000 tigers in the wild and probably only 1,500 now left in India, where until recently we thought there was almost double that. Tigers are used in traditional medicine, even though China has banned that trade and has taken some very strong measures to try and control the trade. Since 1993, the trade does continue, and it's used both in the sort of prescription medicine in the pharmacies, but also in these manufactured medicines such as tiger bone plasters. We're not sure whether they actually really contain tiger bone. That's very difficult to say, and forensics tests have shown it's really difficult to prove the content there. But increasingly, it's not really about traditional medicine. The consumption of tigers has moved into more into the luxury market in terms of a prestige product, and this is typically, you'll see here, these are sort of decanters filled with tiger bone wine. And this actually is a flyer from a brochure from 2006, which we picked up in the Badaling Safari Zoo near the Great Wall near Beijing. And it shows tigers being butchered in very sterile conditions to produce this wine, which is from tiger farms. And tigers are being farmed extensively in China with a view to the market becoming legalized and opened up. You've probably heard a lot about that, so I really won't go further and talk about that issue here. But needless to say, they're also being smuggled from the wild too, and this was one just this month, one of a series of seizures of tiger carcasses coming from Malaysia through Thailand and being seized quite often in Thailand, and they're believed to be going en route to China as well. This is a significant trend that has been emerging as well. Some positive news. This was a photograph I took in 2006 in Lhasa in Tibet, or in autonomous region of China. You'll see these tuba robes where tiger fur is being used there as an ornamental trim on traditional robes. We've done surveys there, as have many of the other organizations like the environmental investigation agencies and others in China, looking at the fur trade. And actually there has been a pretty significant decline in these tuba robe trade in Tibet recently, which is a positive sign. But it's still the trade in tiger fur and other big cat furs more generally does continue in other parts of China. Again, jumping to the other key commodity that we're concerned about with elephant ivory. Asia and China is a really major market for elephant ivory, and a lot of this is coming from Africa, obviously, but the reason it's coming out of Africa is largely due to the large-scale, unregulated domestic black markets that exist in a number of countries with poor governance, like Angola and Mozambique and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And it's pretty easy for entrepreneurs to go to those countries and do deals to ship ivory back to China, often mainly as raw tusks to then be carved in China, Thailand, and also Vietnam. But also there are teams setting up the more traditional, higher quality carving that is done by Chinese carvers and craftsmen. If you look at the trade routes for this was analysis that Traffic did for the CITES conference in 2007 through a system called the Elephant Trade Information System called ETIS, and it shows some of the main markets here where the ivory is coming from and some of the trade routes. And typically we could probably now update that to show that Vietnam has become a key entrepot as well for the movement of trade. And actually Vietnam recently we showed has got the highest price of any ivory anywhere, which is about $1,800 a kilo, which is pretty significant. And there was recently an enormous seizure, like 6.5 tons of ivory within Vietnam. This next slide shows you how the ivory then is smuggled. I think some of you may have seen this. Does anybody know what this is? An X-ray of? Here's a truck. It's a semi, but on the back of the semi is a sea container. This was an X-ray taken by Hong Kong Customs. They have one of the largest sea container ports in the world, and they're doing everything they can to try to stop the trade, but you can only do so much with millions and millions of sea containers coming through. And you'll see that this here, these black bits here are layers of plywood, and that was what the shipment was declared as. But if you look here on the left, this section here, that actually they removed all of the plywood out of this sea container and walked to the back, and it looked exactly like the inside of a sea container with a real steel wall welded in there. But when they cut open that steel wall with torches, they found this was filled with 4.5 tons of elephant ivory being smuggled out of Douala, Cameroon, en route from Hong Kong, and then from Hong Kong onwards into mainland China. And you can actually see the tips of the tusks sticking up here, where these were whole tusks. And they did a search on the person, the name of the person shipping that container, and they found 2 sea containers that were leaving Hong Kong going back to Cameroon, both with false walls but empty, with chips of elephant ivory stuck in the bottom. So it's been a regular route of ivory going through. And it's showing how sophisticated things are really getting in terms of the trade. The other thing, Kevin mentioned also the challenge of internet trade. We've been doing some surveys in China on internet trade for a while, and these are all illegal items, elephant ivory items, that are being sold on the internet in 2007. I'm glad to say that this has been clamped down a good deal by China now, and they really are tightening up on things in light of also their being the recipients of a legal sale of ivory through the CITES process from certain countries in Southern Africa. There were clearly some enforcement gaps going on here, even though China has banned trade in ivory imports since 1991, apart from these experimental CITES imports, and all the stocks are registered pre-1991, and they have this certification system and a registration scheme that seems pretty watertight in terms of stopping laundering of ivory into the legal system. However, the illegal trade is still continuing, and it has its own venues and black markets for selling in that ivory. And a lot of that trade is obviously underground now as China's trying to clamp down. And then finally, I just wanted to close. I've talked really here a lot about the problems and the challenges that we're facing and what's driving trade and why trade is really centered on China right now, and everybody's focusing on that. But I would hope in our discussions we can look a lot more on the solution side in more of a positive way. I want to just mention that enforcement networking and the capacity building programs that have been going on, like ASEAN WEN, really seem to be a way forward, and there seems to be a lot of hope there, and that we really need to make sure that enforcement can work together across political and jurisdictional boundaries to really communicate and coordinate and collaborate to combat this trade, because without that joined up work we aren't going to get the results, and we're just going to see these continual random seizures that go on without coordinated and very well organized enforcement. We're not going to be able to counter that organized crime. I just wanted to give some credit to the US government too, and the governments of Southeast Asia and China for working together. The US government through USAID has been funding ASEAN WEN, the ASEAN Wildlife Enforcement Network. The US State Department has now just been providing funding for a South Asia Wildlife Enforcement Network, and we're really seeing things moving ahead. And the key question now is, how do we bring those enforcement networks together? How do we actually see these fledgling networks grow and really create results? And how do we bring in China into that mix? They're taking tentative steps to engage, and I think they're being very cautious, quite rightly perhaps, in working out how this will all come together. But I think maybe in our discussions today we could talk a little bit about that and what the solutions could be. So I think I've done my time, but just to say thank you all, and these are our websites. There's a lot more information there. We've got probably too many reports on illegal wildlife trade out there to bamboozle you, and you can download them all electronically. I didn't bring hard copies here today, but they're all there in PDF, and there's a lot of research being done. And also, please contact me if you would like further information. So, thank you.
Okay. And I think if it's not the PowerPoints, there are online already. The web PowerPoints are already online, so you guys can access them. They're like the really interesting little chart of like how the Chinese are consuming them and stuff. Okay, we're gonna Cushing, you can come take this one as well. So I've got Peter and Cushing to be the microphone men. Because we're webcast, I do need you to talk into a mic, and please say your name and affiliation real quick before your question. Tough questions. They're tough people here, particularly Kevin. Okay, right in the very back there, and stand up so we can see you too.
Wallace, I'm a public policy scholar here, working on the Amazon. I have a question for Crawford about, or any of you up there, about the farming, like you were mentioning the farming of tigers in China. Is it legal to buy those tigers after they've been farmed? And what is the main concern about the farming? Are they being used as a cover for the illegal traffic of wild tigers, or could you clarify that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. There is a lot of information out there about that, and I can tell you a little bit. The trade in tigers, I believe, has been banned domestically since 1993 in China. Those farms are selling farm tigers, and it's it's my belief that the sale of those tiger products from those farms is therefore illegal, and that's an issue that is pretty difficult to deal with, because the Chinese government, we have a representative here from the State Forest Administration who may actually be able to give you more information about that, but I think that it's a difficult question. It's a hotly debated issue. It's very contentious, and the Chinese government is taking is finding it difficult to engage conservation groups who are opposed to farming. Their view is that farming is potentially a solution to conservation of tigers in the wild. Many NGOs don't think that's the case because they believe, as you mentioned, that it actually could stimulate more poaching of tigers in the wild because there is a preference generally for wild products. And as Laura mentioned with bear bile, the wild bear bile is much higher price and much more in demand than those from farms. And in fact, there seems to be a surplus of bear bile from bear farms, and it's ending up in very strange products like shampoo and others because it's no longer being used from the medicinal supply is being met. So with the tiger farms, it's something that there's a lot of information out there on the web. There's a lot of organizations out there dealing with that. There's the International Tiger Coalition, a group of NGOs who are generally of opinion, and Traffic and the World Wildlife Fund are also part of the International Tiger Coalition, that believe that in the long term tiger farms and tiger farming could stimulate trade, could actually stimulate poaching of tigers in the wild. And in fact, with tigers, it's a species that is so close to the brink now, we just can't take that risk. Whereas with other species where they are much more abundant and prevalent, and whereby an increase in stimulation of illegal trade from the wild they probably could handle. With tigers, they just can't cope with that. Any loss of any tiger is a disaster. Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot of political manoeuvring going on with this, and it will be a subject of much debate at the next CITES conference and at the CITES Standing Committee this July in Geneva too. So we'll see where that can go. But it's a difficult thing to answer because we're getting mixed messages coming out of China on this. Thanks.
Anyone else have anything to add on tiger farms? Or? No? Okay, some other questions. Right up here.
I'm Divya Abhat. I'm with the Wildlife Society. My question is for Kevin. It's sort of a two-part question. You'd mentioned that very often fines and penalties don't reach their maximum level. And I'm just wondering why that would be. And I'm also wondering what would be sort of the highest penalty, for example, that the FWS might have issued in the recent past.
Well, I'll take the second one first. I wish I would have brought some stats with me to say what our penalties are. But I think Laurel mentioned that we have had a few penalties based on Lacey Act convictions for commercialization of wildlife that was either illegally imported or illegally taken in the United States and transported across state boundaries, where it's a felony, and we can get up to 5 years in prison and fines up to $250,000. And so we have reached some of the maximum thresholds there, but oftentimes we don't. But the problem with fines and penalties is that they're not. The statute sets the fines and the penalties, but it's not the Fish and Wildlife Service or the U.S. Attorney's Office which decides how to penalize a person. It's really up to the judge. And the judge does have some latitude in taking a look at maximum fines and penalties. And it depends on, I don't want to say it depends on what the judge's feeling is for the crime, but they're the person who sets the fines and penalties. And oftentimes they tend to err on the lesser side, where they're, dealing with other crimes like drugs and other federal felonies, where they tend to go for the maximum fine. So it's their prerogative, and sometimes we tend to see fines that are a little bit lower than what we'd like.
If I can follow up, is with the judges, because I know that when we talk a lot about China, there's a lot going on in trying to actually train judges and lawyers to understand environmental laws and just understand the sector more broadly. Is there an issue of maybe judges? I guess the drug issue is more broadly understood and seen as a social threat, and is it a lack of training of judges in this area?
I think more it's just a lack of less knowledge. There's less wildlife cases coming into a lot of district courts, and so they really don't have an understanding of who the Fish and Wildlife Service is, or NOAA Fisheries, which also brings wildlife cases, and a couple of other, our other partner federal agencies. And so it's just the new case, the new crime that some judges just don't see. But Lake ASEAN Wen, there's in the offshoot of what's going on in Southeast Asian in the Southeast Asian nations, where we do have federal prosecutors from the Department of Justice training prosecutors and judges in Southeast Asia. It's something that we try to do with a little bit of outreach here. Mm-hmm. Department of Justice has an Environment and Natural Resource Division, which is comprised of wildlife prosecutors or environmental crimes prosecutors, and they try to get the word out to the U.S. Attorney's offices throughout the United States, as well as the various judges. And then it's incumbent upon ourselves and our partners to get with the U.S. Attorney's offices and to get with judges when we can in an appropriate venue to explain who we are and what our mission is.
And you also, one part, last question, it's just in terms of your outreach to Europe, I mean, because Europe is also a big consumer of these products. Do you also have similar outreach to European counterparts?
Well, we don't have any specific associations like the ASEAN Wen that's going on in Europe. We do have, have routine communications with the European Union's wildlife section. We try to attend their meetings, and it's more of a one-on-one personal contact versus an organized outreach program by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Okay. Just curious. Okay, some other questions out there. Right here. Yeah, we'll go 1 and 2. Right there. First, right at the end there, the woman.
Debbie Kopsick with the EPA. I was just curious, you saw the truckload of the pangolins and all the tortoises and all. What is the disposition of those animals when they're recovered and not sold? Can they be reintroduced back, or where do they go?
That is a major dilemma, and it's a really good question. It's an incredibly difficult one to deal with. I mean, the problems of reintroduction into the wild of animals where you don't know where they've come from, they've all been brought together and congregated, their disease can spread between those animals in transit, and to reintroduce them often into the wild could actually have a disastrous effect on the populations back in the wild when those animals mingle back in with the population. So a lot of the time it's incredibly difficult to repatriate animals that have been seized, and a lot of the time they end up having to be basically dispatched and in a humane way, and that's a really sad thing. Increasingly a lot of the pangolin trade now is not so much the live animals, it's much more of these industrial vacuum-packed processed animals, whereby obviously the animals are already dead. And in fact, some governments like Vietnam are actually seizing pangolins and then reselling them once they've seized them. So justifying it underneath making revenue to then keep up their law enforcement and put money back into law enforcement so they can keep doing that good job they're doing. We don't think that's a good idea.
Somewhat a skewed incentive, we think. I think I have a question right here.
My name is Caroline Pott. I work with the Environmental Investigation Agency. I just had a question for Laurel, really, or anybody. But what role does comparative material, say from zoos, for instance, have for the forensics lab? Does that play a role?
I'm sorry, the question?
Comparative material, like if you have something, then you need something to compare it to say whether it's a jaguar or what feather species it might be. Do zoos play a role in providing that material?
Sometimes zoos do play a big role in providing that material, especially if an animal had died. The key is knowing what the animal is. To get the reference specimens, they get it from a whole range of cases. One is zoos. When an animal's died, some of those specimens would come to the lab. Another is natural history museums. Sometimes they take trips to do comparisons within the Natural History Museum. Sometimes it's collected by different investigators or people and sent to the lab. And other times it's actually evidence that's been seized and it comes to the lab. The Brazilian Amazon, the Indian feather artifact case, some of those pieces actually ended up, some of the parts becoming reference specimens for the lab, which is a good use of the product. And also sometimes that evidence goes into educational exhibits about the trafficking. But zoos do play a role. But they also, there is an issue related to museums and zoos regarding taking animals out of the wild as well. And in the Amazon Indian feather art case in Animal Investigators, it's interesting because former Smithsonian Secretary Small had been caught with a huge collection of Amazon Indian feather art, and the source of that art was a different smuggler than the one I follow, but it came from the same sources in Brazil, the same ring. And getting also at the penalty issue that was raised earlier, the trafficker that I follow most closely in this book got 40-month sentence for his role, but the trafficker who sold it to the Smithsonian Secretary got 40 months community service. So you can see a huge range of convictions, especially compared to the value of the items. So.
Actually, Laurel, can I also ask you, because I mean, I was mean, I told her she could only talk 20 minutes about her great book, but one thing to flesh out a little bit about understanding the whole process, like the Brazilian feather case, how long did it take from the time they found that first box of feathers to the actual nabbing him? I mean, it
took about 3 to 4 years in the United States and a few years, 2 to 3 years in Brazil as well. And in Brazil, the cases are still being adjudicated. But what it also does is there's this case, but it spurs agents to also know that this is an issue. And so then they start looking for it. And that's why several other cases came up. It's in fact why the case against former Secretary Small came up. There had been a picture in Smithsonian Magazine, and that had raised interest of him with his collection. And
oops.
So the other former zoo director was also caught with over $20,000 worth of artifacts, and ostensibly the reason that they do this is to protect these creatures, this art and have this history that would be destroyed in its natural habitat, because insects would devour these artifacts, and they're essentially living books of the cultures, but it gets corrupted in the process, so it's complicated.
Misguided.
But that's about kind of like Kevin. So you're talking like sometimes 5 to 7
years. Right. And just as an aside, the person who was convicted trafficking, who got the 40 months, he actually escaped from prison after. And he's still at large. So.
I think there's a second book in there somewhere. Okay, let's see, right, 1, 2, and 3.
Thanks, my name is John.
Oh, wait, if you could get the mic, because we're on webcast.
Yeah, about that. Hi. Sorry, my name is John Waugh. I'm advise a number of different organizations on conservation strategies and planning. And my question is whether there's a public health dimension to the illegal wildlife trade.
Well, I guess I'll take that a little bit, and maybe people can supplement me. But there's both a public health dimension and a wildlife health dimension. I think Crawford was mentioning when asked, do we return wildlife, back into the wild? And no, because we're not sure where it came from. We might have like species, but they mix with species that came from other geographic regions. And here in the United States, we don't reintroduce any wildlife. We may repatriate some back to nations that may want the wildlife back, but we strive to place all of the wildlife that we see as live wildlife into an appropriate facility, because it's just it's not good for our ecosystem to place something that's could be potentially injurious or invasive, into our native wildlife. And most recently, we have seen public health issues come out of illegal wildlife shipments. Not the cane rats, but
pouch rats.
Ambien pouch rats, and what was the disease there in the Midwest? Monkeypox. So we went through that scare a number of years ago. There was some legislation enacted by CDC and some other agencies that outlawed the importation, and we would support those agencies, with policing against those illegal imports.
Because that was with the pets.
Right.
Yeah.
And like salmonella and the reptiles, exotic reptiles, and the invasive issue is huge. I mean, in the Everglades, so in the United States, exotic pets is one of the biggest markets. And in fact, just keep hearing that there's, say, possibly 5,000 wild tigers, or you said 4,000 wild tigers. And in the United States, the figure for pet tigers is 10,000. So there's huge, a huge pet market, and reptiles are a source of disease as well. And in the Everglades, a lot of people release these animals, like Burmese python is a protected species in the wild, yet it's a huge pet. It's very docile. It makes it a good pet till it grows, and when it grows, it gets unmanageable, and so people release them. And in the Everglades, they have a huge problem with pythons out competing alligators and other animals and endangering other species. So it's sort of this strange.
And it could be a human health threat. Pythons bite people?
No.
No. Okay, good. But I mean, just a thought. You don't have any snake things. Okay. We had one over here. Actually, the woman in the green first, and then you. Sorry. I just remembered my short-term memory did return.
Hi, my name's Emily Kennedy. I have a question concerning enforcement against people who are actually purchasing these illegal items. If there are any actions towards that side.
If we can prove that an item's been illegally imported, then your possession would be illegal, and so yes, that would be the enforcement that we would take. But merely purchasing a wildlife product doesn't make it necessarily illegal. Ivory trade's been brought up. Well, ivory can be legally traded here in the United States. There's a robust antique elephant ivory, African elephant ivory trade that is ongoing, and it's perfectly legal under the statutes. So once we prove, if we can prove legal importation, your possession is illegal, subsequent sale would be illegal, and that would be an enforcement action that we would look into.
And Laurel, in your book, you talked about some of that too.
In my book, it does talk about enforcement against some of the buyers, and in the Amazon Feather Art case, 10 buyers had to pay fines, and because they could prove that the items were imported illegally, and they should have had knowledge of it, even if whether or not they did was a question, but they should have had that knowledge of it, like a former zoo director or like a Smithsonian secretary. So, but they're fines, and typically because they're not the ones doing the killing or the importing, it's they're a step removed, and sometimes they use that purposely, and sometimes it's just tourists buying things and can buy things in a government-run shop, so you think it's perfectly legal, but it turns out it's not. And again, in the Amazon case, 7 government officials were convicted on the Brazil side as well. So it varies.
Okay, so, yeah, right there, and then in the back, yeah. Okay.
Hi, my name is Nick Malura from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and I wanted to ask sort of a follow-up question to something that Laurel had said. She mentioned the pet tigers and the pet pythons that many people have. And I wanted to know, because Crawford had also mentioned that he'd gone to this Asian market and he'd seen all of these sea turtles for sale for food. I wanted to know how much of this trade is legal, and if a great deal of the trade is legal, what's the relationship between the legal trade in wildlife and the illegal trade in wildlife? Like, do you feel that the legal trade stimulates demand for illegally smuggled goods?
I'll take part of that. Most certainly the legal trade in wildlife products does stimulate the illegal trade, because it's the folks that are out there looking for the more exotic, the bigger, the better, the grander, and that's most certainly what we saw in Laurel's book. I mean, you could have just a little ivory tusk when you may be able to buy one illegally and get the grand one. I mean, it's a step up on a person. And most certainly, the legal trade does fuel some of the illegal trade. But, we need to step back, and when we talk about certain species in trade, like pythons, perfectly legal to import CITES Appendix 2 species commercially and sell them in interstate commerce. And the release of pythons into the wild is not a federal crime, unless they do it on federal property. So you know, unfortunately, I mean, it does drive to be some problems. And then possession of tigers, you know, within a state is not necessarily a federal wildlife crime. So you need to look at the gamut of what all of the laws are. If merely breeding a tiger is not necessarily illegal as long as it's legally acquired, and if you don't sell it in interstate commerce, it might not be illegal. So, you know, you have a tiger and your neighbor down the road goes, "Oh, that's grand. I want one of those." Of course, it's going to fuel it a little bit. So.
Yeah, I was going to say that there are two major issues, I think, regarding the law. One is the captive bred pets, as Kevin was saying, are typically legal. And so that goes with, say, birds and other animals. Oftentimes wild-caught birds get smuggled in and are sold as captive bred birds. And the lab is working to figure out ways to tell whether a bird is captive bred or wild caught. And, you know, DNA is one possibility, but of course then you need to have something to compare it to. And unless you have the parents, it might be hard. And so they're working on something else called isotopes, stable isotopes. And those are atoms that have different numbers of electrons, and that ratio stays the same from soil to grass to what the animal is eating, so that you can, once you have enough knowledge of how those isotopes change over time and get absorbed, an animal that's been eating grass from the Amazon would have that same ratio. And so you'd ultimately be able to tell whether an animal is captive bred or wild caught. Now the research, there's issues related to the research. You need the databases of isotopes and soils, and you need to know the absorption rates and how they change, but it would be fascinating once this is able to happen to be able to tell wild caught from captive bred, because especially for birds, which are really fragile, you destroy not only the habitat in which they're caught, because typically you destroy the nesting site to get at the animals, say cockatoos in Australia, but also the process of bringing them here. I've heard as much as 90% of the animals die en route because they're smuggled in PVC pipe, their wings are taped, and they're just fragile animals. So for every wild-caught specimen here, you know, there might be 9 others dead along the way. And so the issue becomes bigger than that. But captive-bred pets are legal.
Wasn't just last week we saw the case of the guy that had the birds strapped to his leg? And then a Fish and Wildlife officer saw a bird poop on his feet or something.
Feathers and bird poop on his shoes when he was coming through customs. And
where was this? Which customs entrance?
Los Angeles.
Okay. So
that's, I think it was on CNN yesterday.
Yeah. He must have been wearing bell bottoms or something.
Not very smart. So.
But in Brazil in March, mid-March, the Brazilian Federal Police, together with Interpol, made their biggest wildlife trafficking bust ever, and it was actually a huge trafficking ring related to smuggling macaws, live macaws, and the route was going from Brazil to Europe. And the case was interesting for a number of reasons. One, it involved $20 million and 500,000 animals per year. It was a huge ring that they busted from poacher to transporter to the domestic market to the international market. And in fact, they had six people are involved in the European market are still at large, and they have a red notice issued against them. But the other thing that's interesting is that the case started from an investigation into human trafficking ring, and these same people were trafficking wildlife because they don't really care what product it is. And the other case was that 70% of those arrested, there were 72 people arrested, I think it was, 70% of those people had had a conviction for wildlife trafficking previously, again showing that penalties were too small. And so, the illegal, live bird trade is alive and well, and this involved not just birds, it involved eggs and also jaguar cubs and a host of other things, but primarily macaws.
Yeah, I just think these examples really illustrate the fact that illegal wildlife trade needs that legal trade for a cover, and criminal gangs will go to great lengths to try to launder wildlife through the legal system to legalize and legitimize those specimens. It means they'll get a better price too, but also they've got a greater access to a legal market, which is much bigger than the black market. So the legal market exists for them in their mind to be able to move things into that market, and they will counterfeit permits, they will bribe people for permits, they will make animals look like a different species so that they can go through clearances at border control. So the relationship between illegal and legal trade is complex, and it's difficult to say whether legal trade will stimulate illegal trade or vice versa. But I think it's definitely it's the cover that the crime uses more often than the blatant smuggling, actually.
Okay, good. Right in the back there.
Hi, Natalie Bailey with the Bushmeat Crisis Task Force. And Crawford, actually, I wanted to ask you to expand on something that you said during your presentation when you said that wealth is a greater driver than poverty, at least in China, for many of these issues. With the bushmeat trade, we hear an awful lot about the importance of bushmeat to livelihoods of local people. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that as it impacts wealth versus poverty.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. I think the research we did was in a number of Southeast Asian countries, and we also used a lot of interviews with wildlife trade experts as well, and it was largely the research was based upon perceptions of people about what they really think was driving the wildlife trade. The overwhelming response was that they've seen such a growth in wildlife trade as a result of economic growth within both Southeast Asia and China, and that prior to that, yes, there was subsistence level hunting and use and local domestic trade and use, but it wasn't until we saw the increasing affluence that we saw the scale of the trade really boom and the demand go up, and the ability of people to be connected across distances through modern technology, the internet and so on, means that markets and the world is so well connected, and the traders and the buyers were so well connected that those with the money really were starting to drive the trade, and that yes, the local poorer people would continue to try to eke a living and subsistence use of wildlife, but a lot of it they were now finding was the difficulty in getting the wildlife in the first place, because there was a lot more money in it for going out and collecting now that there was all that financial backing and investment to buy up wildlife on a commercial wholesale scale and trade. So there really was a major shift, and as people saw it. I hope that sort of answers what you were thinking.
And I have one up here, Cushing.
Hi, I'm Philippa Benson from the Wildlife Society, and I have sort of a three-part question. You've all talked about the lack of eyes on the ground, the lack of hands, the lack of people to do the enforcement. I'm wondering both if you can, both Crawford and Kevin, talk about the training that you give and the education to people who can be your eyes on the ground. And as part of that, also going out to public education. Part of the trade is obviously driven by the people who want to buy. Can you talk a bit about the public education efforts that you and others are doing to try and raise public awareness about these issues?
Thank you. Nice question.
Great. I think I'll start. As we stated before, within the Office of Law Enforcement, we have about 200 special agents, 120 wildlife inspectors. But we use partnerships, to leverage our position out there. So within the Department of Interior, you have a number of federal land management agencies, BLM, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, and they all play a role in wildlife law enforcement within the Department of Interior. So, we leverage that by just, making our partners aware of what our role is and what their role is as land stewards. So, you've just turned, our 300 Office of Law Enforcement folks into, I think Interior has close to 4,000 law enforcement officers.
Do you have actual materials that you give to other offices
Yep. We routinely do additional training when they're at their basic training program at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. We'll provide them with the necessary materials, that explain what wildlife law enforcement is. But each of those agencies has the responsibility on their own property to do wildlife law enforcement. So the National Park Service, if somebody poaches an elk in Yellowstone, will end up being the lead agency doing wildlife law enforcement. We are the only agency within the United States outside of Customs that does the importation of wildlife, but we certainly do have programs on our properties that manage it. Department of Defense is the same way. We routinely partner with different DoD elements. We have agreements with the Marine Corps to do wildlife law enforcement, where we supplement their authority with our Title 16, which is the federal wildlife crimes within the U.S. Code. We give them authority to enforce it on DoD properties or Marine Corps specific properties, and we're trying to work with the other agencies. I stated before, we train Customs when Customs or Immigration and Customs Enforcement is at their basic training at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center. So we try to leverage all of the potential partners we have, whether they be the land-based folks or the folks at the border. We're just starting to reach out right now to Border Patrol and their basic academy, just to try to give them an idea of this is what you may see, because like we said before, we're at 38 ports around border ports around the country, but there are 300 plus places where somebody could come into the United States, and often we're not there, and then the first person at the border they may see is either Immigration and Customs Enforcement or Border Patrol. So we try to leverage all of our partners, just at least make them aware of who we are, what we do. And if you see something, the best thing that you can do is grab it, seize it, and call us. And then it's in the international realm. It's what we're doing with the International Law Enforcement Academy. We've taught in Botswana. I think we went to Costa Rica. There's an academy there. We're taking a look at doing some additional outreach and training at some other facilities. We coordinate with the Department of Interior's International Training Assistance Program, and we've put on training in Tanzania for wildlife officers. And we usually do that in conjunction with other elements within the Department of Interior, because a lot of the foreign countries, and especially in Africa, are looking for more specific protected area enforcement. And so while the Office of Law Enforcement, we're criminal investigators, we're not bound by geographic boundaries like Park Service, like the Bureau of Land Management, or the law enforcement component of our National Wildlife Refuge System. We try to coordinate, with our uniform counterparts to provide that protected area enforcement, whether it be in Asia or in Africa. And so that's how we go about leveraging our partners.
Thanks. I'll just mention a few things. I mean, there's, in terms of training and awareness raising, the breadth of conservation groups are working on trying to support training and awareness work around the globe on wildlife trade. But an interesting anecdote was I was recently in Pattaya, Thailand, for a workshop there that was entitled "The Forgotten Crisis: Wildlife Crime in Asia," and that was quite relevant, really, because in a world where everyone is focusing on climate change and terrorism and the economy, there was a general feeling that people were starting to forget about wildlife crime, and this was a major Asia-wide meeting that really was looking at what we can do to make sure it stays on the radar, and it had a number of ministers there, and it actually institutions, and the meeting was actually funded in part by USAID, by World Bank, by Traffic, by others, and representatives across the range of the international governmental organizations like IUCN and UN Office of Drugs and Crime, Interpol, and governments from throughout the region too. And the findings really were that they decided that they would create a manifesto for combating wildlife crime in Asia called the Pattaya Pledges. And luckily we weren't disrupted by the other troubles that were going on, and we got that work done and the manifesto going out there. It was exactly the same time as the rioting from the red shirts at the ASEAN summit. It was to coincide with that, and unfortunately some of the senior leaders weren't able to attend because they were being helicoptered off the roof of the hotel down the road. But we did manage to produce that manifesto with the Pattaya Pledges, which set out a framework of what people are going to try and do to try and keep this on the radar and bring about change. And awareness really was a critical element of that. But clearly, some examples of materials that are produced. I mean, I've got a video, actually. I could show you a video of what we're doing on consumption in China.
Video. Lyndon's like, yes. Thumbs up. We like videos.
If it will
Lyndon,
I don't know if this, I've been having troubles with this, but
she's gonna solve all of your problems.
There should be a video you could run. That was an ad that was shown in 2008 called "Don't Let This Be the End of Tiger Evolution," and it's aired on the news channel of all the Air China flights during a week, and it's estimated it reached about 800,000 people in that 1 week just on those flights alone, and also on the Beijing subway line during a month of May and June last year to celebrate the International Day for Biological Diversity, and that is estimated the flow of passengers who could have viewed that video were around 3 million people per day. So this video is one of a series of awareness ads that have been run in China, funded by WWF China, but working with an ad agency, a marketing agency within Beijing, who produced those ads, which apparently appeal to the mindset of people in China to try and start an awareness movement about some of the consumption patterns that are ongoing in China and Asia more broadly, to try and make people think about what they're doing and maybe thinking about changing their behaviors. It is vital, and I think that's the ultimate solution. I mean, we can have guys like Kevin and his team constantly working 24/7 trying to stop the trade, and it will never work. And they need more resources, there's no doubt about it. They're doing incredible work. But we need to address the consumption and as well as the crime. And we need to build up a mindset that it's just not the thing to do, it's not acceptable, it's not helping the planet, or it's not going to help them, people and the planet in the long term too. So I feel that the awareness and outreach work is of vital importance. And that's just one example of a myriad of them. And we've got other people around this table who are real experts in this field, like Natalie and like EIA and others, who have been doing a great deal of work in this regard, and they could probably talk to what they've been doing too.
Yeah. About a year and a half ago, actually, when we had our first meeting on the Beijing Olympics, we had a guy from Wild Aid. Some of you that were here, is probably the funnest opening I've ever had a meeting. I didn't say anything. We put on a video of, and because Wild Aid produced a series of public service videos in China that used Olympic athletes, and the first one that we dimmed the lights and there was a gunshot, and then I can't remember which of the runners, but he was racing with a cheetah, and he leapt up and stopped a bullet, and Yao Ming saved an elephant. And he said, they did it with CCTV. It wasn't done with the official Beijing Olympic Committee, but they saw Yao Ming doing it. They said, and so they basically said, let us take this, and so that also, that was a major opportunity to reach out to the public.
And they helped produce a video for the State Department and the Coalition Against Wildlife Trafficking with Harrison Ford as well.
Yeah.
Hollis might want to mention something about that, which was the same team. They produced this great video about wildlife trafficking that's on the website.
Yeah, we have them on our website if you want. They're great videos, but they
pretty dramatic. Yeah.
Some other questions or comments? I think I might have missed. And if you grab the mic, that'd be super. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Christina Vellis. I'm with the Agency for International Development. I'd like to go back to the confiscation question that was raised earlier, because it's really upsetting to me that this is millions and millions of dollars worth of goods, and it seems like there should be an entire organization itself just in charge of what to do with these goods. So I'm just curious, like ivory, for instance, that was confiscated. I had heard years ago that there was ivory burning, which seems almost just as criminal if that money could be used to go back into the conservation of elephants in Africa, for example. So I was just curious if you could tell me, who's responsible for these goods, who decides what happens, is there some kind of protocol of what to do with it's millions and millions of dollars worth of stuff.
Okay, I comment a little bit on that and then hand over to Kevin. It's a difficult issue. I think just jumping to the issue of the live animals, IUCN have a specialist group called the Reintroduction Specialist Group to provide guidelines about reintroduction. It's very good work, and it's a really good format for people to really understand what they should and shouldn't do when we're talking about dealing with live animals that are confiscated. And I'd recommend any government to use that, and most governments do tend to use that, but you do have some anomalies. The problems are when you get huge volumes of animals that are probably in really poor shape already. What do you do with those guys? And there are very few solutions for that. When you've got a fewer number, yes, they can go to zoos or they can go to local people to look after who are breeders or collectors or something. When it comes down to the commodities, that can cause some challenges when you're talking about illegally sourced commodities that need to be disposed of. I think, the burnings of ivory are a symbolic act. They're an act that many support because it sends out a strong message that this is the wrong thing to do. And they burn it to show that it can't re-enter trade and be used. Now, other people would disagree, and say, well, we should be selling those goods and then saving that money and using that to put back into conservation. And in the case of ivory, where the ivory has been legally sourced, that's just what CITES has just done, where a number of countries like Botswana, Namibia, Zimbabwe and South Africa have legally acquired stocks of ivory that have come from problem animal management, natural mortality. They've been allowed to trade that through the CITES system to Japan and China. And that ivory is something that's not come from seized, poached animals at all, and so it's sort of clean ivory in a way. The whole other angle of selling products that have come from poached animals and from illegal sources is very difficult, and that you're really providing some incentives there for trading further in illegal items. It's a very difficult thing to do. Some governments will do it. Some governments will sell seized products, and maybe Kevin would want to talk about what the US does.
And that's where I'll keep my comments to. So after the Fish and Wildlife Service becomes the owner or the recipient of the property, it's gone through a court process and it's been forfeited to the federal government. We have a couple of different things that we can do. Under the CITES Treaty, the source country, if they so want, and if they want to pay, will repatriate a product back to the source country for a CITES product. So that's one potential venue. Live wildlife, we work with an informal network of partner zoos and other facilities to go place it. As I said before, we're just not going to release an imported bird into the wild here into the United States. Again, we'd like to send it back to its country of origin if they so choose to want it back. If not, we'll try to place it in the appropriate facility. And then we have the National Fish and Wildlife Property Repository out in Denver, which houses all of our parts and products that are imported. And so we have a couple of different options that we can do with it. Some items, depending on what the condition is, we may destroy it because it has no educational value. It has no value to put it back out into the public eye. Some stuff, if it's unique, we'll put it into museum and educational kits, and we send that out routinely. And then we can also, the United States does sell some wildlife products that are otherwise legal in trade. So CITES Appendix 2 species, what we saw in the sea turtle boot trade that we were working out of Mexico, sea turtle boots were being laundered in with other legal skins that if those skins would have had proper paperwork would have been okay to sell, like python and alligator. Those products are otherwise legal in the trade. We have done and are planning to do, or not planning to have done auctions of these otherwise legal products, and the money goes back into the Lacey Act reward account, which we can then use, for enforcement purposes. I think it's only happened one other time since the repository's been around, but we're strictly guided by what our regs say, how we can dispose of wildlife.
Okay, do I have any final last quick question in the last 2 minutes? Oh, one over there in the corner. Oh, if you could grab the mic. Sorry, we're on webcast, so. And you'll close us out with this question.
Rowena Watson, and I wanted to know what other regions or countries have forensic labs up and running. I'm assuming that the United States is a leader in that, but where else is that happening, and if we're working with them?
Or could it happen next week?
The U.S. has the only dedicated wildlife crime lab in the world. That said, there are other wildlife forensic labs elsewhere that are starting up or going to, or there's a lot of discussions, or they're attached within the human forensic crime lab. So the Brazilian Federal Police has a forensic lab that handles wildlife. The Kenya Wildlife Service, actually as a result of training and the education efforts from the Fish and Wildlife Service, is exploring currently setting up a wildlife forensic lab, but that too would be part and parcel of their normal forensic, human forensic lab work. Canada also has that, but again, it's not a dedicated wildlife crime lab. And then you have private labs as well, which work on wildlife issues.
And we're working
India
with
is
the North American Wildlife Enforcement Group to set up a lab in Mexico. The Mexican authorities have been up and they've taken a look at our forensics lab up in Oregon, have met with Ken Goddard and taken a look at the process. And so we're trying to supplement them. We've had scientists from Thailand come in and take a look at our lab and work there. We've also sent our morphologists out to Bangkok to work on some cases. So, as Laura was saying, we have, our lab is dedicated solely to wildlife and law enforcement, but I think you're slowly seeing, some resources getting put into forensics labs around the world.
And we brought the circles complete. We came back to, the whole reason, Laurel was the catalyst for this. And so, Laurel, your books, it's a way cool read. It's an inspiration, but it also was the catalyst for me bringing these people. These guys are doing very important work. And I'm really honored that we could, have you all here to talk. And you can all gently tackle them at the end. Ask some more questions. Also, at the end, I do have to always say thank my funders, the USAID, Rockefeller Brother Fund, and the Environment Foundation, and all of you. Any of you who are maybe new to our Wilson Center or China Environment Forum, come see me or Lyndon, wave your hands, if you want to get on our mailing list, because we do lots on China. Bye. Thank you, everybody.